welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. Thank you to the Justice Research Center for hosting this conference, and of course to our distinguished panelists who we'll hear from in a few minutes. In my role as panel moderator, I was asked to start today's panel with some context about race-based policing in Minneapolis. And as I thought about where to start my remarks, I wondered how far back we should go. I'm currently writing a book about the politics of policing in Minneapolis, and I actually start with the founding of the city, right? Which only happens through the dispossession and mass killings of the region's indigenous groups, including the Dakota and Ojibwe people. Or we could start in 1903 when the article "The Shame of Minneapolis" was published in McClure's magazine, outlining how the city's infamously corrupt mayor, Doc Ames, used the MPD to run an extortion racket with illicit saloons and gambling halls in the city. Or we could look back to Bloody Friday in the middle of the Great Depression in 1934, when the MPD violently broke a truck driver's strike, aligning with business interests and shooting and killing labor activists. Police, politics, and power have always been deeply intertwined. But perhaps the more proximal starting point is the 1940s, when Liberal Mayor Hubert Humphrey declared that all MPD officers would complete race relations trainings, a first in the nation. That training, an early precursor of some of the police reforms in our own time, would focus on identifying overt racial prejudice among officers and attempting to eliminate it. Yet the training did little to address a lack of accountability when officers abused their power, and it did little to address what activists would come to name as structural racism, or the ways that our systems, institutions, laws, policies, and practices produce and perpetuate racial oppression. And officers in Minneapolis, as across the nation, were steeped in a social structure that treated Black Americans as less than white Americans, implicitly and explicitly. It was structural racism, for instance, that would allow the area's leaders to construct a series of highways that raised important Black enclaves in the Twin Cities and facilitated white flight into the suburbs. In the 1950s and 1960s, more and more Black Americans would journey north to Minnesota, looking to escape the Jim Crow segregation of the South. But they found that racism followed them. Whole swaths of the city were unavailable as white residents in the North fiercely defended residential segregation, as well as economic opportunities. By the 1960s, Minneapolis's Black population was largely isolated in North Minneapolis, with another set of blocks around what would become George Floyd Square in the present day, locked out of the prosperity enjoyed by the city's white residents. And that isolation would periodically erupt into violence, often prompted by police misconduct. For example, in 1963, MPD officers beat a local Black organizer, Raymond Wells, prompting a melee between a crowd and several officers. While the Minneapolis NAACP would presciently declare that many policemen in Minneapolis treat members of minority groups as second-class citizens, the mayor, one of Humphrey's proteges, would release a statement denying, quote, any serious race bias, unquote, among the city's police force. By 1965, the Minnesota Advisory Committee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights would issue their first of many reports on policing in Twin Cities, declaring that, quote, no antidote is provided to dispel the lack of confidence with which minority groups regard the police departments of Minneapolis and St. Paul that lead to hostility and provokes tension on both sides, which in many instances could be avoided, end quote. 2 years later, in 1967, North Minneapolis's Plymouth Avenue would erupt in flames, part of the nation's long hot summer and a precursor to the unrest in 2020. In the wake of that 67 unrest, city leaders promised to do more to address racial inequality. At the national level, the Johnson-appointed Kerner Commission called for major transformational federal investments into U.S. cities to intervene in what they called, quote, two societies, one Black, one white, end quote. The unrest, however, also fueled conservative mobilization, including the ascendancy of police officer associations, who in cities like Minneapolis grew in strength in part to resist efforts towards police reform. By the end of the 1960s, voters across the U.S. had propelled Richard Nixon into the White House, while closer to home, Minneapolis chose the Police Federation leader, Charles Stenvig, to lead the city. In 1971, Stenvig would be reelected by a wide margin, beating out Harry Davis, a longtime civil rights leader and the first Black mayoral candidate in Minneapolis. And it's those decisions in the 1960s and the decades that followed that we're haunted with today. We did not get massive federal investment in eliminating racialized poverty or discrimination. Instead, cities were largely left to their own to address rising inequality alongside white flight. As a result, we saw the expansion of the criminal legal system with unprecedented numbers of Americans arrested, convicted, and incarcerated. And periodically, we would see calls to address police violence as well, with a chain of civil rights reports outlining the failures of our police department in the city, up into the Minnesota Department of Human Rights recent investigation. But facing calls to get tough on crime, Democratic leaders in Minneapolis in the 1980s and the 1990s, like their counterparts across the country, helped to expand policing and punishment, including during the years that the city would come to be known as Murderapolis for its high homicide rates. City leaders would attempt to thread a careful needle that we still see today, promising residents that they would make the city safe while also pledging to rein in the thumpers on the force. And alongside that expansion of punishment came stagnation and racial progress. Minnesota, for example, is widely reported as one of the best places to live. And yet those statistics are in part a racial illusion, driven by the well-being of the majority of residents who are white. The city and state's Black and brown residents face a different reality, producing some of the highest rates of racial inequalities in housing, education, and employment across the nation. And those inequities shape wildly unequal experiences with victimization, both in the community and at the hands of the police. So in an analysis of MPD's stop data, the New York Times and the Minnesota Department of Human Rights found that about 60% of MPD's reported use of force instances involve Black residents in recent years, despite the fact that those residents make up less than 20% of the city's 430,000 residents. At the same time, Black residents in Minneapolis remain seriously underprotected, constituting more than 2/3 of the city's homicide victims, a toll that would rise starkly in 2020 and 2021. This duality means that the city residents most in desperate need of the state's protection are often also the ones who are most subject to its violence. It's these statistics and the experiences they summarize that made Minneapolis one of the national epicenters of calls to make Black Lives Matter. When people came out onto the streets to protest in May 2020, it wasn't just about the horrific murder of George Floyd under the knee of Derek Chauvin, but also about the cascade of routine harms by the MPD and previous cases of fatal force in the area. But it was also about the strength of our communities, our activist organizations, and civic groups, all of whom came together to protest this latest injustice. And it's those same people, groups, and institutions who are still here today fighting for change, whether through the charter initiative to replace the MPD, legal cases against the department, city and state level police reforms, efforts to build community power and alternatives to policing, and just as importantly, initiatives to address racial inequities more broadly for Black Minnesotans. Some of the tools at our disposal are new, but police violence and police reform are not. We have the chance today to think about how to learn from the past in order to change the future. And so it's in that spirit that I'm very excited to be in conversation with our two distinguished panelists. And I'd like to open up our conversation just by asking both of our panelists to tell the audience a little bit more about who you are, your own personal story and background professionally, and what brings you into this conversation today. And so if we can, for this question, if we could start with Ms. Daniels. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Well, thank you all. I'm happy to be in conversation with Dr. Phelps and Commissioner Lucero. I'm excited for what's to come. A little background on me. I, as my bio mentioned, am the inaugural managing director for the Minnesota Business Coalition for Racial Equity. And I come to racial equity work as a business leader. I've spent over a decade of my career in large global enterprises. And what it's taught me is that there is transformative power in the business community, right? There is size, there is scale, and there's influence. And the work that I do in leading the Minnesota Business Coalition for Racial Equity is specifically thinking about how to harness that power, how to hold that influence and direct it towards racial equity to build a more just and prosperous Minnesota for Black people. The work of the coalition is, as I mentioned, focused on justice and prosperity, and specifically on driving positive economic outcomes for Black Minnesotans. There are a number of barriers, some of the disparities that you mentioned, Dr. Phelps, that impede the ability for Black Minnesotans to achieve the same economic access and freedom as white Minnesotans. And there are a few of them that the business community is really uniquely positioned to play a role. So our work focuses first on employment opportunity. Our coalition is about 50 or so member companies that are really large employers, and Black Minnesotans should be employed in those companies. The second area is Black business development, thinking about how we support and invest in the ecosystem of Black entrepreneurs. And then lastly, around community well-being, and that we define as advancing just practices in housing, safety, and policing. Building safe, thriving communities is essential to thinking about economic access and opportunity. And it's important that all Minnesotans feel safe in their communities, and that is safety in all aspects, safety when they're engaging with peace officers, safety when they're engaging with each other. And so that is a priority area of focus for us as well.
Terrific. Thank you. Go ahead, Commissioner Lucero.
Okay. Well, thanks so much for having me here. It's great to be on the panel with both of you. Thanks for the Minnesota Justice Research Center for putting together this just really phenomenal event and these discussions all day today and yesterday. Dr. Phelps, I really liked how you started your intro there, where you're like, where do we start this conversation? I always feel that way when people tell me, who are you? What brings you this conversation? I'm like, I don't know where to start with that. It could be in so many different places. So, I mean, what brings me to this specific conversation today is the work done by the team of incredible investigators at the Minnesota Department of Human Rights over the past few years to conduct a 10-year pattern or practice investigation into the city of Minneapolis and the subsequent work around all of that. Myself, I'm a civil rights attorney who deeply wants to do systems change work. So spent a lot of my time professionally, not necessarily practice law, but working in public policy at both the state and federal level to really look at the policies and processes that are needed to create that lasting transformational change, where I was finding so many cases were just about that individual in that moment, which is of course incredibly important, but wasn't resulting in that coordinated, sustained change that needed to happen across the board. So I was appointed to this position as Commissioner of the Minnesota Department of Human Rights in 2019 by Governor Walz and Lieutenant Governor Flanagan. And I feel really blessed and excited to do this work because it is that perfect mix of both lawyering, which I'm not sure that's quite a word, and policy work. And I get to do that with just an incredibly powerful team, really brilliant and kind people that work really hard all around me. I am from a very different world than here. I am from Albuquerque, New Mexico, but have been in Minnesota at this point for, I think, now over 20 years. And it is a different world here than New Mexico. But I think that helps, that has shown me great appreciation for what is here, because I fell in love with this place for a reason. And then choosing to be in a place and then therefore insisting that it is the very best place possible for everyone here is part of why I love doing this work and what brings me here today. So there was, I think, about 18 different entry points for you there because I wasn't quite sure which way to go either.
Terrific. Thank you. Yes, we can start at one point, but time is always a flat circle, right? Exactly. So we're going to start again at a different point. So one of the themes throughout the conference so far, we heard, last night during the keynote and again in the panels I was in this morning, is this idea of just how political all of these issues around criminal justice reform are and have been in the United States. And I think we're in a particularly powerful moment around thinking about reimagining policing in particular. And people have mentioned in the panels about how to think about building bridges across political divides, and also how to think about the sort of import of the recent midterm elections, particularly around the seeming failure of these sort of scaremongering tactics around crime to support more conservative policies. And so I wonder, given what a complex moment we're in, both in terms of political divides across the left and the right, but also real divides within the American left about how to best address issues around racism and discrimination inside and outside of policing. I wonder how you both manage your work in this space and how you think about being accountable and responsive to all of the different constituents for your work. So this time, if I could turn the mic first to Commissioner Lucero.
Yeah, sure. Okay. So I think first and foremost, I am very aware of the complexity and the nuance of every single word around this. And so first off, I always ask for a little bit of grace around it, because every word means something to somebody that may or may not be the intention of what I'm trying to say, but has an impact to them. And so words like reform or transform or reimagine in and of themselves are incredibly loaded. And reform is what we've been doing, and transforming isn't enough, and reimagining is, all of it is messy. And so what helps for me and kind of keeps it in some ways cleaner for me is that my responsibility is to enforce the Minnesota Human Rights Act. And under the Minnesota Human Rights Act, we want to make sure that it does not matter what system you are in, you want it to be free from discrimination. And so that could be in education, that can be in housing, that can be in the policing model as it was yesterday, and it will be in the policing model that it is tomorrow, public safety model. And so that's how I try to talk about it as a systems conversation. No matter what system we have or we are building, the Department of Human Rights is always interested in making sure that that system is free from discrimination, free from sexual assault, free from retaliation. And so that is kind of allows me to stay away from the messiness around all of those other words, and try to hopefully find a Venn diagram or where we can all come together to recognize that non-discriminatory, constitutional public safety in all of its forms is important to public safety writ large.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate the conversation around being thoughtful about language choices. I remember sending a colleague of mine an early version of the proposal for the book, and she got through page 1 and she said, I had to say, stop. Like, I need you to define, what does safety mean? What does violence mean? What kind of violence are we talking about, right? Who are you talking about when you say the police? Who's the community? How do we think about, what it means when we say the voices of the community? I think all of those terms, before you even get to, right, how do we distinguish between reform, transform, dismantle, abolish, right, and all the gradients within those terms, right? What is the problem that we're talking about, right? And how do we define it? And one of the things that I've appreciated about the work that the department has done in their report on the MPD is the careful nuance about how to think about what discrimination means, right? Does discrimination mean that we should see evidence of just disparities, or does it mean evidence of disparities that control for different kinds of things, right? Like how many encounters police have in certain neighborhoods. And I think doing that work really carefully and being very precise about what we mean by something like discrimination is really important for moving policy forward. Ms. Daniels, do you want to chime in on this?
Yes. And I too love that we started with the importance of language, because words are powerful and they sometimes reflect the experiences and the assumption, right, and everything that people are bringing into a specific topic. And I think the conversation on public safety and policing is a prime example of that. In the world of building and leading a coalition, I am constantly kind of building bridges, right? That is the work of coalition building, and listening to different stakeholders and voices on a particular topic, and building empathy. So separating my own personal experiences and beliefs as a Black woman, that is certainly a big influence in terms of how I show up and what brings me to the role in leading MBCRE. But I also recognize that I represent a coalition of corporations and businesses that may have different points of view and certainly have different experiences on race, racism, safety, economic opportunity. And so I spend a lot of time listening and really trying to understand where people are coming from, what's informing their point of view, what assumptions are they making, right? A lot of times, or in this role in particular, I've discovered that we can assume that everyone is reaching the same destination, right, based on being presented with the same information or a certain set of facts, when no, we're all bringing a different set of experiences, applying a different lens. And I'd say the things that I'm doing most often in trying to navigate that complexity and that nuance is really asking simple questions, right? What are you assuming to be true? What made you say that? How do you define X, Y, or Z? Because at the heart of it, I think that can start to help us unlock where we can feel like we are at a stalemate.
Yeah, thank you. And one of the things I heard in that answer that I think is a good pivot to one of our next questions is around sort of how you think about who your coalition is and the team that you're trying to build. And so I wonder if you could just say a bit more about how you think about the business community in particular as a coalition, and how to think about the kind of the organizations, the people that you want to partner with, and how that reflects the values of your own organization and your work.
Yes. MBCRE is business led, and I like to say community informed. I think we understand in this community that, or I don't want to say in this community, understand that like when corporations especially want to get involved in the community, want to do the work, a lot of times it's corporations forcing their ideas or solutions on those that are impacted. And we're at a place where we're recognizing that that's not the way forward. And it requires a pretty significant behavior shift and unlearning of certain behaviors in the business community. And I think of the work that we're doing as the business community is the action, the army, right, that you want to move forward. But our strategy, what we are doing, should come from the truth of Black Minnesotans. We spend a lot of time in our work listening to community leaders, experts on the various topics where we want to be engaged, connecting with those folks that are really close to the work on the ground, doing the work on the ground, to really then be introspective about what do we need to do differently if we are seeking a differential outcome than what we've seen today in this community. And it's a very different posture and position for the business community to listen first, right? If you are running a company or running a business, typically you want to build you think you know the answer and you want to race after it. But if we are really chasing true transformation and racial equity in this community, we've got to flip that model on its head. And so a lot of what we're focused on in being a business-led, community-informed coalition is what are the tools and practices we need to either build or tear down to ensure that the corporate community is listening first and not just throwing resources or its support behind solutions that it wants to prioritize, but that will actually have the transformational impact that we want to see in the lives of Black Minnesotans.
Mm-hmm. Terrific. Thank you. And then, Commissioner, I would pass the conversation over to you, and with a similar question around sort of who do you think of as the groups and your partners and allies in this space, and how do you think about the relationship between your organization and the work that you're doing and the community members that you're trying to uplift and protect?
Yeah. Thanks for the question. I think it's a really important one because it absolutely is going to take all of us, and it is absolutely going to, I mean, there's something that you said, Tiffany, around what do we need to do differently if we want a different response, being so like that's so essential to what has to happen. And it's going to take everyone asking that question and doing the work from their point to make that kind of transformational change that needs to occur. And so, for us, and I'm going to speak specifically about the investigation with the City of Minneapolis, that was about doing things differently. There have been a lot of reports and blue ribbon committees and outcome. I mean, but there has not been that coordinated, sustained work that happens over time that outlives the political cycles, the budgetary cycles, and everything. And the tool that exists to make some of those changes is a consent decree, which is a court enforceable agreement. A court enforceable agreement requires that coordinated change that has to happen. And so for coordinated to change, that of course involves city, and MPD, but it also includes making sure that we are listening very carefully to community members. And we have been extremely intentional about working with community groups throughout this entire investigation. And there's a lot of details about that in our findings, but I'm particularly proud of the work that we did with the Minnesota Justice Research Center over the summer, where they went and they talked directly to different community groups all across the city, held 15 listening sessions on top of the work that our agency was also doing, really making sure to meet community where community was at and center folks that are impacted across the board. So for instance, the very first event they held was with folks that were previously incarcerated, which I think speaks beautifully to like the values of the work that they were bringing to make sure who was being centered and listened to. They have a really beautiful report that will be coming out to detail that work of what they heard, and being able to report back to community and say, this is what you said was important. And then, once we are done negotiating the agreement, being able to hold ourselves accountable to what we heard across the board there. We also intentionally worked to hear from MPD officers themselves. We talk a lot about like how hurt people. If there's a culture of disrespect, then of course there's going to be a culture of disrespect. During our investigation, our team of investigators met with officers in person at every precinct for hours and hours, one-on-one or in groups. They went on ride-alongs. This is during the height of COVID. And then following the announcement of our findings, we worked with 21CP. We work with them right now. They're national experts to come in and meet directly with officers there too. And so, who do I think are our allies and our partners? I mean, everyone, the foundations, the business community, but it is everyone. And then it's just for me about where do my tools build those bridges the easiest, and recognizing all the tendrils that come from all of it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I love it. Go ahead. Build on Commissioner Lucero's point around the role that everyone has to play. If you've ever heard Dr. Hoover Williams from University of St. Thomas, he talks about how we, are always looking for a happy ending. And what is that, silver bullet to addressing racism in our community? And the thing that I think we are all learning is, one, there is really no silver bullet, and it is going to take everyone, everywhere, challenging every system. And it's less about what is the single most transformative thing that we can do here in the state. It's more about what are you currently doing thinking of your sphere of influence, what are the ways that you can challenge practices, challenge systems, advocate for change in all those arenas, because that's the only way we're going to see true transformation. And I will say, as I lead MBCRE, that is a shift for business leaders, right? To think about, I don't have the single solution. I need to be thoughtful and recognize that this is going to take time. And oh, by the way, we're at the very beginning of the journey. And that is a very new muscle in the corporate community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, terrific. This is sort of related, but one of the things that I think has been interesting to me is that when we think about policing, it's such a masculine profession, right? When we think about the prototypical police officer in our minds, many people will automatically picture a man. And of course, most police officers in the United States are still men, although women have made inroads into the profession. And if we look at the cases of lethal police violence that have really spurred movements, in many cases, those have been the deaths of Black men in particular. Although the Say Her Name campaign has attempted to sort of raise the salience too of Black women who have also been the victims of police violence. But what's interesting is that behind all of those men, both the police officers and the victims, is that so many of the people doing the work to, lead protests on the ground, to lead racial justice organizations, to do the work of change, much of that is being led by women, right? And women of color in particular. And so, given that we had a panel where our speakers were women of color, I really wanted to highlight that and lift that up for a moment, but also to give you a little bit of a chance to talk about how your own lived experiences have shaped the work that you do and have provided you, with pathways to your change, but also the difficulties, right, in trying to do this work in the social identities that you both inhabit. And so I would leave it up to you, whoever wants to hop in on that one first.
Go for it, Tiffany.
Oh, I can start. I think one of the strongest influences on me and how I show up in this work has been mothering. And I use that word intentionally because I think about the role that my own mother played for me in demonstrating what strength and resilience and leadership and community looked like. And so that was the model that I was shown growing up in Detroit, Michigan. And then it was my own journey to become a mother. On the day that the world was finding out about the murder of George Floyd, I also found out that I was pregnant that day. And I carried an immense amount of both grief and joy over the course of my pregnancy. It was this duality to that entire experience. And I think that duality, even just being in the streets of Minneapolis, we all felt it. There is something beautiful happening in the midst of something very heartbreaking and tragic. And it was that experience, that shift, that literally led me to this work. As I mentioned earlier, I was a business leader. I was working at General Mills, running businesses, running like multi-million-dollar cereal brands, and really looking for a different way to leverage my time, my talent, specifically for Black people. That's what I was looking to do professionally. I was past a point where I could volunteer or do something on the side. I needed to.
Oh, shoot. I think we have maybe lost one of our panelists. So Commissioner, why don't we turn it over to you and hopefully we will get the feedback going in a minute here.
Oh. Oh, okay, good.
Oh,
I didn't want to.
You're back, Tiffany.
I keep hearing you talk.
So it was that experience for me professionally, saying that I needed a shift. I needed to do something different. It was a call that I felt in my soul to use what I felt like I was good at for a different purpose. And that led me to learning more about the coalition, learning that it was the perfect role for me in this moment at this point in my life and in my career. I mean, I tell people all the time, I don't know if this is my forever job. It's probably not my forever job. Actually, I know it's not my forever job. But it is the work that answers a call that I felt deep down in my soul for right now. And I think that came from the way that I was mothered and me carrying my son through the racial reckoning that was happening here in my community.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. That's such a powerful story, and such a heartbreaking timing, but congratulations, of course, on beautiful children, who I have 2 children too, who gave me the head cold that you're hearing me speak with. So that's lovely. Thank you for sharing. Okay, Commissioner.
Oh, I just am going to talk. I just think that my identity and my experiences absolutely define my leadership and my work in this. And there was something that Tiffany said there. She said about the duality around carrying both grief and joy. And I definitely think that my experiences and my identity make me extremely resilient, but it is that ability to carry both grief and joy at all times that I think is really, core to the ability to do this work. So, I am a queer Chicana woman, person of color, raised very working class, Catholic, poor. I'm the only person in my family with a college degree, and I am the only person in my family that makes more than $30,000 a year in my immediate family. So, I mean, I went to school because all over the place I saw problems and just tremendous, just real problems with a lack of justice across the board, and the pain that resulted and carried forth with that. And I just have a very clear memory of my dad telling me, like, well, if you want to make a difference, because gosh, I was always causing trouble, and being like, but why do we do this? And so he's like, don't ask me why, go be a lawyer, go do that work there. And so that's how I sort of, ended up down this path. Like many people, I have members of my very large, much larger family who are police officers, firefighters, who wrestle deeply with addiction and mental health, who are social workers and therapists and teachers. Of course, I have family members who have spent time in prison. And so, like for all of us, this is just incredibly deeply personal when we're talking about all these issues. This is my family, my community. This is, why we do this work. And I do think that women of color are that are doing this work are very aware, for me, all of the things that you're carrying with you as you're doing this work, and all of the people who have come before you to get you to this place. And that gives you the skills to code switch quite a bit, to be incredibly adaptable, to Venn diagram our interests and our framing and our tone, and sit in a space of tremendous joy and grief at all times. And so I think that is really important to how I do this work, and how I show up with the team. And I think it allows me to build bridges and connect with people in a different way. That's really important to moving this work forward. And I'm grateful to be able to do it.
One of the things that, if I build on the commissioner's point, I think one of the things that is so important to hold when you're working for progress in any arena is possibility, potential, right? Because this is hard, like really, really challenging. And the barriers some days seem insurmountable, right? You think about the tactical barriers that you may be faced with at work. You think about the political climate and that conversation, and it can just feel like, oh my gosh, I cannot see a different world. And I think what leaders have to hold, both the men and women and all the people that are doing this work, is a commitment to what is possible, right? That is the thing that keeps us moving forward, that propels me every day. And that sense of possibility can come from a lot of different places. Like for me, it came from growing up in Detroit in a homogenous environment where everybody looked like me, right? My teachers were Black and everybody was Black. And so I wasn't raised in a place where Black people were in the margins. So I grew up with a very just knowing that Black people could do and could be anything. And that's the possibility that I think I have to hold and carry on the days when it is very daunting to talk about advancing racial equity and dismantling racism.
Yeah, thank you. That's actually a great transition to the next set of questions. And I want you guys to hold on to the idea of hope, right? And what moves you forward, because I want to end on a note of hope and leave people with a little bit more of that happy ending that they want, or at least a glimmer of that happy ending. But before we get to that, I want us to go low before we go high, and to talk a little bit more about those barriers, right, that you face that sometimes feel overwhelming. And so maybe we'll start now with Commissioner Lucero around sort of how are you experiencing barriers in your work of pushing this forward, and how do you think about responses to some of those barriers?
Sure, those are two. So I think that there's like 4 really solid barriers that keep coming up over and over and over again. And that first and foremost is a deep erosion of trust. You spend time with community members, local leaders, and police officers, and over again, you hear profound pain and frustration. And within any relationship, without trust, there cannot be growth. And trust has to be earned, and it can be earned every little bit at a time, but man, it can be undone instantly, very quickly. So that leads to, I think, the second barrier is disengagement. And that is not surprising when there's such deep erosion of trust over such a long period of time. And that is everywhere, just kind of like this, like, what's the point? So it is not uncommon for me, for instance, to be meeting with foundations or business leaders, and I'm sure you've also experienced this quite a bit, Tiffany, where it's sort of like, we already invested so much. We gave this huge grant. We did this like big thing, and nothing changed. What's the point? And hearing that from policy leaders, from business leaders, from like that disengagement is a really big barrier. It's hard to bring people back from that. I think also another barrier is expectations around perfection. Because of all of the mistrust and the pain, and it means that, like, okay, to earn that trust, everything must be perfect, and that's just really impossible to achieve. It is completely understandable to have very high expectations. We as taxpayers are paying a lot of money to have quality constitutional public safety, and like, these are people's lives and so I get that is a standard perfection, but it's hard. And then I think that, of course, exhaustion is the one that you see, where you see people coming in with a lot of energy, and that's tied to disengagement. But there's just a lot going on. Things have never been easy, but there's just so much work to undo the systems of oppression across the board, not just in this one area. And there's such a public platform for direct hate that's kind of permeating our culture. It is constant. Sometimes I joke about how racism never takes a break, but it is actually not a joke. It never takes a break. And so the exhaustion is real. I do remind myself all the time that, like, things have never been okay, and also things are always going to be okay, like just kind of holding both of those. But I think those are the most powerful barriers. And then you can put in like politics and all of that all around it. But I think that those are the 4 areas those are the themes that come out of those bigger areas.
Yeah, thank you. It's interesting too, because I see the same themes actually in my classroom, right? With my students, I teach on the University of Minnesota campus a class on policing America. And every year I teach it, it's a different mix of students with different experiences. But this year, the sense of exhaustion and disengagement is really overwhelming. And I had the students the first day of class do a word cloud where I said, you think about police, what's the first word that comes to your mind? And the word that was the biggest on the word crowd was corrupt. And that was a little bit surprising to me. I hadn't had that happen in earlier semesters. And I asked them, I'm thinking like famous corruption scandals, bribery. I'm like, well, what does corruption mean to you? And what my students told me was, I just don't feel like anybody's really fighting for us. And I just feel like the entire system is unfair. And so I just disengage. And, I think those are really powerful forces happening right now in American politics where people are disengaging, right? And particularly 2 years after the murder of George Floyd, right? This feeling that we did do so much, but what came of it? And I think trying to get people re-engaged or continue to be engaged through the midst of all of that hard work is really challenging.
I think that those are certainly all like a lot of the big ones that I experience, and that disengagement can show up in so many ways. One of the ways that I've seen disengagement show up is in shifting priorities, or that kind of different sense of urgency. I won't say a lack of urgency. I'll call it this. There's a different sense of urgency, in that, in 2020, there was, everybody was signing up for the fight in multiple ways, propelled by, the news cycle or guilt or whatever it was, right? And I think some of that was, it was difficult to look away. And now that we are, 2 years and some change after that, we're getting into the real work, right? We're no longer admiring the problem in the way that we were 2 years ago, but we are starting to have deeper conversations and shift the right narratives and think about disrupting power centers in a meaningful way, and starting to attach what are the specific actions that we need to take to be able to achieve the transformation that we all talked about very loftily in 2020, and to hold that at the same time as everything else seems to be in motion. Right? Our economy is in motion in a different way. Inflation is higher. Businesses are supply chain challenges. Everything else seems to be in motion. And so how do we maintaining that sense of urgency to help, I'd say, offer a opposing force almost that disengagement is really important. The other challenge or barrier that I'll say that I experience is the lack of knowing what to do. I don't know what to do, so I am going to do nothing. And even if it is not intentional, we are paralyzed by options, paralyzed by the seeming, I think, just overwhelming nature of the change we seek. And so it is, I think, easier to just stop, feel like you got to boil the ocean. I don't know what to do, so I want to, do a study for a long time, or I need to get all the information, or, I'm not comfortable just leaning in with what data I have readily available. And we will never have all the information. You will never have every single piece of data that you could ever have. It's more about how do you think deliberately about what you do have, and how do you listen to the folks with experience, and then become convicted about a path forward, right? We don't live in a world where there's perfect information. And that can be challenging, especially when we're having a conversation about racism that I'd say in this country and in this community, we haven't been comfortable having as bluntly as we're trying to have it right now.
I really appreciate what you're talking about. It's like this real fear of change or getting it wrong or trying. And so that can lead to, well, we need to study more, or we need more information, or we need more, or maybe we just don't try at all. Just try things. Like, let's go. Like, the urgency is real. And I government, business, nonprofits and foundations, like all of us need to get out of our headspace of spinning and being afraid and being like, but what if we do something different and it doesn't work? Well, then we've crossed that off the list and we keep on going. And I feel like that there was that willingness to be bold and to try things in 2020. And now we've gotten back very much to a fear-based place of, and you know, politics certainly leads to that or helps reinforce that. But man, it is that I think that fear of getting it wrong is paralyzing, and you know, please get over it, I guess.
Yeah.
All of us.
Yeah. Do something.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's the theme of the conference, do something. Okay, so we have a couple questions in the chat, and this is actually a good segue for one of the questions around politics. And the question comes from Marcy. And the question says, the election day numbers showed that about 10% of DFL voters voted for Schultz over Ellison, and conversations while door knocking before the election indicated that people believed Keith, quote, hated the police and that they could therefore never vote for him. So how do we get messaging on police and public safety reform back on track? And so that's a very specific question, but I invite you just to think broadly about like, how do we think about the political messaging on police and public safety, given all the disengagement and distrust that we just talked about?
You start?
Yeah, I mean, elections have always and will always be messy and gross, but I don't necessarily think that that's the that needs to kind of define the way that this work is going on. And in fact, in many ways, it doesn't. That isn't the way that it's going on. There's a lot of places where there's deep alignment about getting these things correct. You know, accountability is important in any business or any entity, and it's also important within police departments. Making sure you have good policies in place is true whether it's an issue and concerns around sexual harassment and assault with students or in the workplace, and also in the police department. And so there's just a lot of alignment around strong policies, good accountability, really good training, and a culture that enforces kind of the customer service that we're paying for. We are taxpayers paying for constitutional public safety. And so I mean, the theme of this conference is building bridges. There's a lot of bridges that are here. There's a lot of Venn diagrams. There's a lot of commonality, and elections just never bring out the best of those bridges, which is unfortunate sometimes.
Yeah. I mean, I think this takes me to where we started this conversation around language. And when you are in conversation about anything, whether it be public safety, policing, getting to some level of shared understanding about what you're talking about. And I think for a number of reasons, we've all experienced when, two parties or two groups are talking past each other, even if they may want similar things or thinking about something similarly. And language can be a really powerful tool to create a bridge. And so that's a challenge that something I have to push myself to do, to not make any assumptions. It might seem like I'm asking the most basic question, like, what does that mean to you? Can you define safety? Things that, we might all think are like, of course we all know what that means. No, I no longer make assumptions about what it means. Have that tough conversation, ask the question, because that is the way to really build a sustainable bridge for sure.
Great, thank you. So I want to take one more question from the audience before we transition back to the other set of questions, which is, I think, a useful question because, again, it's a very specific question. I'll read it in a minute, but I think it points to a broader concern about when do we actually want fewer bridges and when do we want sort of bulwarks against bridges, and in what ways, how do we come to a consensus about that? So the specific question is from Ash, who says, Right now, I'm thinking about how the police are used to, quote, support businesses and developers. And I've heard about a complicated relationship between business owners and developers funding and supporting the police. That also might look like fighting not to have a new shelter for unhoused folks in St. Paul, or violent sweeps of the encampments. How do we untangle the relationship between businesses and developers and the police? Or what are business owners really saying to you about their desired reality? Because I've heard the claim, quote, developers won't want to develop in Minneapolis if we defund the police, end quote. So what is truly behind that statement? Thank you. So I'd encourage you both to think about that question, but I think too, there's a broader question here of how do we think about, we've used the language of constitutional public safety, and I think we'd all agree that one of the core values of constitutional public safety is that you're taking input from the community and reflecting that in what public safety looks like. But where is the line between reflecting the values of community and allowing certain voices in the community, particularly more privileged voices, right, to set policies that impact more marginalized folks?
Cool. That's a big one.
Yeah.
And I think the challenging nature of like that question is phrased in a way that reflects the reality that I live in this job all the time. And it is the thing that I continue to come back to when interacting and having this conversation with business leaders is around whose safety are we talking about? We ask that question a lot. Because we have to remind people not to center themselves. And it is in our work, it's about the voice of Black Minnesotans and how Black Minnesotans are experiencing, or the experiences they're having in their communities or in our communities. And that is a completely different frame for some business leaders in a way that they haven't thought about safety before. And I think ultimately where we get to is, what are the elements of safety that we can agree on in the simplest of terms? And I think the hard part, especially for me as a Black person, is it may not be as transformative as I would like to see personally. But then I think about the full ecosystem, and there are groups and organizations that all play a different role in advancing justice, and that more aggressive, progressive role is not necessarily where the business community may be, and it's up to our members, leaders, to help us get to, well, what are the places of mutual understanding, and to be okay with that, to be okay that progress in this area may not look completely transformational coming from the business community, but there are other forces that could be pushing in a much stronger way. Hopefully I don't know if that answers the question.
Well, the way that she asked the question was like, there was so much to unpack there. It was kind of unfair. So thank you for starting. But it's a really important question. And I think that the thing that is sitting with me is that I sit in a lot of spaces where I'm told this is what insert wants, and it's spoken as truth and fact. This is what the business community wants, or Black community wants, or government wants, or liberals want, or conservatives want, or Latinos want. And I'm just like, deeply suspect of anyone who claims they speak for any one community, and it happens all the time. And I'll get told, like, you can't talk to those people because they don't speak for us. And I think that the more we're having lots of engagement, the more you find all of those places that intersect everywhere. And there is no such thing as a monolith of anybody, nor any, there's just a real diverse viewpoint of this question specifically about developers and businesses, just as there's a real diverse perspectives around individual people. And so I think anytime anyone says this is what insert wants, I think, okay, we need to do a lot more engagement and action, because it's just never that simple ever. I try really hard to not tokenize someone's, like, a person because of their race, nor like all business people. Both are like equally problematic, and they miss opportunities for us to see like our complexities and all of our places where we actually have great differences, but also great commonalities too. And both are valued. And it isn't quite so either or when you stop seeing us as a monolith.
Yeah.
I don't know if I answered your question either, but that's what's sitting with me.
And I appreciate the inclusion of, I think it's your dog back there, Commissioner.
Oh, Taco. Yep.
My favorite part about remote conferences is the pets. So I was just going to add to that, there was this interesting example in Minneapolis where, one of the groups pushing for the creation of what became the BCR, the Behavioral Crisis Response Team, was actually local businesses. And we heard earlier today about the LEAD initiative in Minneapolis on Lake Street. And that's another initiative where local businesses have a role to play there. And local businesses means a lot of different groups, right? It means tiny mom and pop shops that are deeply connected to the community. And it means multinational corporations, right, that exist everywhere and everything in between. But they're part of the work too, right? And figuring out, for instance, like, when do shopkeepers call 911? When do they treat things as criminal incidents versus something that can be negotiated more informally? That all is part of the work too. Ash commented in the chat, just to follow up on this, quote, "I'm thinking about the sentiment of people's lives matter more than property, and fear of people who are experiencing homelessness, and your desired perception of safety at the cost of safety for others, and that police are used to protect property, not you." Trying to hold all of that together now. Thank you. And what that comment made me think about, and something I struggle with myself when I think about this work, is the language of safety, particularly in Minneapolis, really kind of took over the public conversation, was really the sort of the discursive strategy in which the fight over the charter amendment was waged, right? It was which one of these proposals would lead to more safety for residents of Minneapolis, with people's different understandings of sort of who the community was, what safety meant, and how these different choices that the city presented would or would not lead to safety in the community. And I wonder if we've sort of done ourselves a disservice by setting these conversations up as, what would it take to make everyone feel safe, when the feeling of safety is so subjective. And as we've seen with cases like the permit patty, right, in some cases, that is a tool of oppression, right? What makes a person feel safe may be the sort of forced removal of other people in public space. And so obviously we want to put some constraints on of when people can call up police in order to resolve problems. And so I wonder how you both think about sort of what safety means for you and how you integrate that idea of what would it mean to keep everybody safe with the work that you do, whether that be constitutional policing or whether that be trying to advance racial equity.
Well, yet again, a very loaded question that could go 80 different ways. So let me see. I appreciate that you're talking about, is the right question make people feel safe? Because you have to always be recognizing that you're asking that world in a racist world, that we have grown up in this society that has taught us and embedded us this idea that that Black men in particular are inherently dangerous. And so if you have these kind of tropes in your head that are deeply concerning, problematic, racist, and you don't even like, I'm not even saying you mean to or not, I'm not getting into that, and it's just that it just is there, then safety and what makes you feel safe. And when you're saying that, we're centering whiteness in that moment, which in and of itself is a problematic thing. It is hard. I appreciate that Tiffany asked the question, like, what is safety, not what makes you feel safe. And so what is safety is maybe the nuance of language that's a little bit important there. For me, whatever is delivered, I don't care if it's an ambulance service or a firefighter or mental health provider or somebody who does or does not have a gun or does or does not have a badge. I want them to treat somebody that they encounter the same when they are Black and when they are white. And our findings show that you can control for all sorts of different variables, the time of day, the location. So you cannot say that these things are the result of like, well, we're in a certain neighborhood, or well, there's something going on there. It is literally the same place, the same time, and you are seeing dramatically different ways that you're treating people, and race therefore is the reason. It cannot be anything else. And so that is what I care about more than like the what does it mean to feel safe? That is an important question, and I really appreciate that folks are really wrestling with that. I just want whatever the system is to be treating people the same and not be treating, in Minneapolis, Black people, Indigenous people, worse than they're treating white people for the exact same action.
Ditto.
We're going to leave it there. Okay. Thank you very much, both of you. Okay, so let's make our ascent into the high place, a high ending note here. We've got about 12 minutes left. So I wanted to ask you both sort of what do you feel kind of the most excited about in your work? Maybe we'll start with kind of looking backwards, and then our last question will switch the lens to looking forward. But in the work that you've done over the last couple of years, what do you see as some landmark successes, and how do those give you hope about building bridges and seeking solutions?
I can start. I mean, I think in the last year or so, even getting to a place where major corporations want to have a conversation around public safety and police reform and want to explore and identify their role, feels like a progress, right? Feels like a win. Getting to a place in the last legislative session where we could articulate, these are the priorities that our member organizations would hold up as it relates to public safety, pushing on, reform measures in the post board, thinking about the importance of funding youth intervention programs and co-responder models, recruiting officers that reflect the communities that they serve, even getting to a level of specificity in language from the business community, or from the members of the coalition, felt like progress. Like, oh, wow, we are moving from a place of kind of talking about what we wanted in 2020 to actually starting to put, words on a page and the change that we seek. And so I am excited about where that can go next, how the collective influence and power, resources of our members, that we can really leverage it to really get to transformational change in Minnesota.
Thank you. Commissioner.
And the question again is like kind of what gives us hope for all of this, right?
Yes, although we're not looking forward yet. That's going to come next. This is what in the last 2 years have you felt, where have you felt like you've really been able to make a difference and intervene, and the work that has felt sort of the most powerful for building bridges and seeking solutions?
Okay, thanks. I was like the last 2 years, I was like, oh, is that where we? So I think the place where we've had the biggest impact in the last 2 years was George Floyd was murdered by MPD police officer on May 25th, 2020. June 1st, we launched this investigation after hearing from community members loud and clear that there needed to be this comprehensive investigation that occurred. Under the Minnesota Human Rights Act, we were able, within a week after that or so, to file a temporary restraining order against the City of Minneapolis that instituted immediate changes to public safety, and that's around banning chokeholds and neck restraints with no exception. It required the city to catch up on a pretty extensive backlog on discipline, potential discipline decisions that needed to be made. Because if there's a problem, you need to address it and not let it sit there. It also changed the requirements for intervening and made it much stronger than it had been. So there's a lot that I could say, more details about that, but that was immediate change that is usually done within a couple years after, as part of a consent decree or court enforceable agreement. We did it immediately. And when it comes to building bridges, it just simply would not have been possible to move that kind of court order that quickly without the long hours of work with the city council members, the mayor's team, and then Police Chief Rondo. So, for instance, in that court order is a requirement that any decisions about who's using chemical weapons, and you remember what was happening right after during the protest at that time, it had to get approved by the chief at that time himself. It could not be line supervisors, which is where it was happening. That idea and that requirement came from Rondo himself. And so because of those conversations and those that work, that was implemented into the court order, and that fundamentally changed the policy, and that lives on to this day. So that, I think, is the biggest change of the last 2 years.
Terrific. Thank you. Mm-hmm. So then, as promised, to close us out, I'd love for you both to reflect on about what gives you hope for the future and sort of where you see your work headed in the future. So, Commissioner, if you want to just keep narrating us and take us to the present and then the future in your work, and then Ms. Daniels can close out the session.
Sure. It was in April of this year that we announced our findings, and it was a comprehensive investigation that got us to this point. We did our homework. We did it very well. And so now this information and these findings are before the city, and they have chosen to move forward in negotiations. Let's get this settled and get towards the change that we're seeking on the other side. And so that is something that does give me a tremendous amount of hope. This is different than something that has ever existed before in Minneapolis. And I mentioned that earlier, but I'll just stress that right now, because this court enforceable agreement will require specific changes that the city and MPD will be required to make to address discriminatory policing. It requires the parties to follow legally binding agreement, which is overseen by a judge and issued by a judge. It provides clear timelines for accountability and prioritization. So you have that coordinated, sustained approach. And speaking of that, it lives on regardless of election cycles and budget cycles. It will live on past me, past these leaders right now. And that's important because it takes a long time to do deep culture change work. It cannot and will not happen overnight with any one person. And I think lastly, what it does that has never been done before in Minneapolis is incorporates independent oversight through a team of monitors that regularly report progress to the court and community. Will it solve everything? Absolutely not. I think we have said over and over again that we all have a role to play in this, and we all have to be pushing. But is this going to help and at least be a focal point for a lot of bridges and amplifying a lot of work that's gone on? Yes, absolutely. And so I'm very excited of what's next there. And that leads me to ultimately what gives me so much hope is people doing the work. And there are so many people being so brave and so bold within the institutions themselves, within police, within the city, and then all over community and community leaders and community groups. And people are doing this work with all the rage and skepticism and fear and hope and joy, all of it. They hold all of it. We're holding all of it, and we keep doing the work. And so that gives me just tremendous hope for what's next. But I know it'll be a long road ahead. There will be setbacks, but we're going to try to push it as far as we can.
I have to completely echo the optimism that I feel from being around leaders in this space. I think in the last 2 years here, we have birthed almost a new generation of leaders. There's certainly a lot of folks that have been around this work for a long time, but I am really encouraged by the energy and commitment and the fierceness that I see in leaders like Commissioner Lucero, like other folks that are on the front lines and doing the work. That is, to me, the strongest signal that we are going to end up in a more just Minnesota for all of us.
Well, thank you so much to you both. I really appreciate that both of you are doing the work, and I really appreciate that I got to have this conversation with you both. Yeah, thank you. All right. Well, I think we're going to let everybody reclaim an extra 2 to 3 minutes of their time. But thank you so much for joining us and being a part of this conversation. I hope to see all of you in the panels this afternoon and keep it going.
Thank you.